You made the introduction.
Yeah, cool. Okay, Mert Arslanalp, he's a political scientist. He received his political science and IR degree in Boğaziçi University. And then he's doing his PhD right now in Northwestern University. He's about to finish it. I think he's going to defend it in June, God willing. And then he's studying in comparative historical research. He's doing comparative historical research. His areas of specialty are comparative politics and political theory. His subject matter, which we are going to see a glimpse of it today, I think, is urban politics and social movements. Social movement, and he's engaged in comparative historical research communities, right? So good luck.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me here to give you this talk titled Claiming Rights, Negotiating Exceptions, Politics of Land and Housing in Istanbul and Buenos Aires. As Yunus mentioned, this will be a talk based on my dissertation project, which I'm still in the process of writing, but I'm about to defend it in June. And my objective today is to deliver you some of the core theoretical, conceptual, and empirical arguments of this dissertation. And this will be the first time that I will be presenting the project in its entirety. I have presented different chapters in different venues, but this one will be giving the comparative framework of the project. Therefore, I'm really looking forward to your feedbacks, and again, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Let me begin by describing these two pictures. So on the left, you see a photo from Buenos Aires, where inhabitants of the informal settlement called Villa 31 are protesting for their housing rights. Villa 31 is one of the oldest informal settlements in Buenos Aires. Villa is kind of the equivalent of Gecekondu in Argentina. They are one of the oldest, and they are one of the most contested ones. Due to their location in the most affluent part of the city, which is the Retiro district. This photo was taken on May 2012, and people were, as I said, were demanding their right to housing, and especially demanding the government to initiate the in-situ urbanization project in the neighborhood. If this project is implemented, the services are going to be upgraded, the houses will be either improved or replaced by new ones, and the tenure conditions of the inhabitants of the neighborhood will be legalized. And their demands were based on the constitutional recognition of this right, as well as the legal recognition of it in several different legislations of the city. On the right, you see a photo from our very own Başıbüyük neighborhood, which is a Gecekondu neighborhood located in the Maltepe, within the jurisdiction of the Maltepe municipality. And the protest was one of the many contentious acts Başıbüyük inhabitants organized between 2006 and 2009 to stop the urban transformation project from happening. And this urban transformation project was initiated by TOKİ, Maltepe municipality, and Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality. So during these protests, Başıbüyük residents articulated their right to live in their residential places. They rejected relocation to TOKİ buildings under long-term indebtedness, and often demanded the granting of property and construction rights for their current dwellings, as it was formally and informally promised in the past. So basically, briefly, in these photos, what we observed are these grassroots practices of urban citizenship. In other words, we see ordinary people making right claims on the material space of the city in order to access it and or participate in its organization. In the recent years, the interdisciplinary urban scholarship has increasingly started examining these acts from the vantage point of how urban processes and democratic citizenship shape one another in globalizing megacities. So in these projects, we see scholars exploring how city might be an alternative source of rights and obligations as distinct from the national scale, how competing urban projects make different claims to urban space and pioneer different conceptions of urban rights and belonging, and how the popular sectors utilize right-based and non-right-based strategies to deal with the exclusions marking capital's urbanization. Despite the many valuable insights of this scholarship, there are only very few attempts for a comparative analysis of how urban citizenship is being formed and transformed over time, and how and why we see different configurations of urban citizenship across different cities and metropolitan areas. More importantly, we lack conceptual tools for facilitating such analysis, particularly because the very concept of urban citizenship or citizenship in general is a very loaded concept. It connotes a normative ideal, it connotes a particular political subjectivity, a particular type of political relationship, a set of social and political practices, a discourse of legitimation, etc., etc. So if you want to do comparative analysis of urban citizenship and look at the dynamics behind it and see how it transforms over time and across territories, we basically need to disaggregate the concept into its different dimensions. And this is one of the things that I'm trying to do in this project. And I'm doing this by basically making this conceptual distinction between citizenship practices and citizenship regimes, following scholars like Margaret Somers and Trastili and Deborah Yaşar. By urban citizenship regimes, I mean the legally enshrined rights and obligations that govern access to urban space and participation in its organization. So the concept kind of tries to get at the formal institutional dimension of citizenship. By no means citizenship itself can be reduced to that dimension, but I would argue that this dimension, the formal institutional or the legal dimension of citizenship, is a core dimension of it, and we need to recover it in our research. And most often in urban scholarship, there is a tendency to obliterate or not paying enough attention to this legal core of citizenship concept. So furthermore, in developing this this concept, I distinguish between two, I would say, ideal types. One is property, the urban citizenship regime, and the other one is social urban citizenship regime. In the former one highlights the modality that makes individual property ownership the primary legally recognized source of entitlements pertaining to urban space, whereas the latter entails alternative legal grounds for entitlements that kind of restrict the commodification of land and housing, that give grounds for participation in urban decision making, that protects those who do not have property from market forces, or facilitates access to collective property arrangements. So basically, we can go on with a long list of different rights that can be enshrined within the urban citizenship regime that gives alternative legal grounds than property rights itself. So this is again an ideal, typical, these are two ideal types. In reality, we see mixed parts, but we can still map these different citizenship regimes perhaps across a spectrum to analyze how they vary from one another and how they shift over time from one type to the other. So during my research in Buenos Aires, I found institutional changes towards a social urban citizenship regime, whereas my analysis of Istanbul demonstrate that from 1950s onwards, Istanbul maintained a propertied urban citizenship regime. And as I said, this looks at the formal institutional dimension. In practice, this doesn't mean that property rights were always enforced. However, the formal institutional dimension of accessing land and housing remained to be tied to the institution of property.
Since 1950, right?
Yes, I would say like since the beginning of the massive urbanization of Istanbul. So, building on this conceptual framework, the broad research question that I'm asking in this project is what explains the institutional continuity and change in the urban citizenship regimes? But more specifically, I pose the question of what explains the variation in the urban citizenship regimes of Istanbul and Buenos Aires with respect to the legal rights urban squatters have pertaining to land and housing. So basically, in order to shed light on this broader question, I'm trying to answer this more specific question empirically through our comparative historical analysis. And in that, I narrow down my research focus to the rights of the urban squatters, and I do this because most of the time, the position of the urban squatters within the broader urban fabric is the most controversial one with respect to the rights that regulate urbanization. And this is because, basically, by definition, squatting is encroaching upon property rights that is fundamental to capitalist urbanization. And in that sense, I believe we can understand more about this citizenship regime, urban citizenship regime of a particular city by focusing on these groups and their relationship to the state. So in formulating answers to this research question, I draw upon three fields of study within, I would say, within the intersection of comparative politics and political sociology. These are historical institutionalism, socio-legal studies, and social movement scholarship. So I try to use their analytical tools to examine these research questions. And following the social movement scholarship, I argue that new rights are being enshrined in response to grassroots contestations over these rights, and they can only be enshrined if there are political opportunities available to access institutions. And by political opportunities, I mean both institutional openings, such as decentralization of the urban governance system, for instance, as well as elite allies that can provide access and appropriate these institutional openings. So this is a pretty standard or like a common argument within the social movement scholarship. But the real question is, when are such grassroots contestations over urban space is more likely? So when do these grassroots contestations over urban space occur so that there can be rights-based mobilization, which can then perhaps intersect with available political opportunities to enshrine new legal rights in the urban system. And my argument is the likelihood of such rights mobilizations to emerge depends on the extent to which the states try to enforce the property rights law in its interactions with the informal settlers. So claims for alternative rights emerge only when states actually try to enforce their property rights laws vis-a-vis the urban squatters. Only then there will be contentious episodes emerging in the city as states use eradication policies like slum clearance policies, urban redevelopment projects, etc. to displace or relocate urban squatters. And against those attempts, we will be seeing popular sectors challenging them by carrying out mobilization, by generating new organizational structures, making new linkages to civil and political society, as well as making use of social rights to legitimize their claims. So only in those contentious moments, social rights as a legitimation tool become important to be able to access urban land and housing. So against attempts to enforce property rights, you see resort to social rights and use of these social rights both through extra-institutional mechanisms as well as through institutional mechanisms. Obviously, I do not want to claim that there is a mechanical determinacy between an attempt for eradication and the emergence of mobilization. There is high degree of contingency involved in those processes, and there's, not all eradication attempts generate mobilization, but they are likely to generate more mobilization than situations in which states do not actually enforce the property rights law routinely. So in contexts where the states make routine, de facto, and de jure exceptions to rule of law as a strategy of governance, popular sectors will have less incentives and motivations to carry out mobilization for social rights. Basically, this is because making exceptions lower the costs of keeping dominant institutions for the actors who would be normally disadvantaged if those institutions were enforced properly. So under those circumstances, grassroots politics begin to revolve around negotiating these exceptional measures. So in contexts where the states states opt for a strategy of relaxing the laws or not enforcing them either through de facto practices or by de jure measures, we would see less intense incentives on the part of the urban communities to actually make right claims using different alternative rights discourses. So what I mean by exceptions is, practices and measures that suspend the normal functioning of the institutions without actually changing them. So exceptional measures or exceptional practices suspend the institution for a specific territory, for a specific population, or for a specific time period, without necessarily changing the broader rule that characterize that institution. De facto exceptions imply the weak and selective enforcement of formal rules in practice, and to some extent these are common everywhere where there are informal settlements. Like the very existence of informal settlement depend on the toleration of the state. So in that sense, de facto exceptions are not by themselves like a distinguishing variable, I would say. But de jure exceptions, we witness de jure exceptions more rarely. Only some states make use of de jure exceptions. And when I say de jure exceptions, I mean ad hoc legal measures that render the established rules and procedures ineffective. And an example to this can be construction amnesty laws that were regularly passed in Istanbul, for instance, or ad hoc regularization programs, which do not necessarily define a social right to regularization, but just carry it out for specific territories for specific time periods. So unlike rights, exceptional measures neither have the juridical protection that legal rights have, nor they have the categorical universality the very concept of right implies. So exceptional measures, by definition, are legally ambiguous in terms of their status within the legal system, and they are most often particularistic. So the outcomes are most often uneven and legally ambiguous territories. So what you see is, within a neighborhood, you see a certain part of it being covered by a law, whereas the other part is being excluded from it. Even the part that is covered, it's not clear whether that will last forever, or whether those people can actually have legitimate claims on the courts to protect those, to protect their tenure rights. So overall, these measures generate legal heterogeneity, legal ambiguity, and particularism. So basically focusing on these exceptional measures and how they can reproduce property rights kind of gives us this paradox in the sense that measures that might violate property rights in the short run can have this long-term institutional effect of reproducing property rights by incorporating certain people who would normally be excluded from property rights into their ambit. So you pass an exceptional measure, you integrate a certain population within the framework of property rights, at least partially, and you also create the expectation of eventual full property rights in the future, and in that sense you incorporate that population into the institution of property, and by that you reproduce the institution of property in the long run. So therefore, in contexts where states regularly make use of these measures, I argue that it will be less likely for urban rights mobilizations for alternative social rights to emerge. So that's kind of the gist of my argument. Obviously, exceptional measures, or whether or not the state is enforcing or making exceptions to the law, is not purely autonomous from relations of power within society. I do not think we can model it. During Q&A, I can give you, some of the variables that I think that are relevant for these relations of power, such as like the electoral leverage of urban squatters, the strength of urban growth coalitions within the urban system, etc., etc. But I would say this decision to enforce or make exception is determined by the play of social forces, social and political forces within the society. But again, I do not want to model a determinist. I don't want to lay out a deterministic model of it. I don't think it is actually possible. So this is kind of, I'm not sure if you can actually see it, but yeah, the thing is I wasn't able to do it on presentation, so I did a screenshot crop and copy it. I'm kind of computer illiterate, and this is not very professional, but it still kind of lays out the basic model. So it's enforcement, exceptions. Enforcement leads to contention. Contention leads to rights mobilization. Rights mobilization and political opportunities interact, and that creates change. Change towards social urban citizenship regime, and then this shows exceptions opening the path to property ownership. Whether it's going to be concluded or not is another question, but it still puts the population in that path, which kind of leads to negotiations over these exceptional measures. So people pressing for the completion of these measures and negotiating with local municipalities or political parties to fulfill that path. That overall kind of reproduces the property urban citizenship regime. So we begin with property urban citizenship regime because that's the assumption. I guess in capital cities, the original framework is based on property rights, and in some contexts that can add new social rights to the legal frameworks regulating urbanization. All right, I'll be quick. So methods, let me quickly go over it. I have used comparative historical analysis and small and qualitative methodology. I carried out comparisons across time, across cities, and across neighborhoods. So I compared two historical periods in Istanbul, first one being from late 40s to 1990s, and a second period from 2002 to 2012, like the contemporary period. Within the second period, I compared urban conflict processes in 4 neighborhoods: Başıbüyük, Düzce, Gülensu, Derbent, and Ayazma. My research predominantly focused on Başıbüyük. That's kind of the primary case, but I also gathered data on the other 3 cases to basically both to increase the analytical leverage, as well as identify some of the micro variables that might actually shape the contention processes. In this talk, I'm not going to focus on those micro processes a lot. I will give you like on the empirical side, I will give you a more macro picture, but again, you can perhaps go deeper during the Q&A. So obviously the big methodological question is, how do I justify the comparison between Istanbul and Buenos Aires? I'm using a most similar systems design. I do not claim that these cities are identical except for one variable, and that's why that variable explains the outcome. They are not identical, but still, both the cities and the countries kind of give me opportunities to control for certain variables and focus on the dynamics of urban politics. So I'm able to control for national regime types, economic development models, development level, the transformation of the city from an industrial climate city to a global city, and kind of level of social inequality in the sense that both societies lack, for instance, institutionalizing inequalities like slavery, etc. So again, if you want, we can discuss, how I can elaborate on each of these during the Q&A. But again, I must say that I'm using comparative methodology, but I'm primarily relying on within case analysis and process tracing. So in that sense, I'm not only drawing leverage from Millian methodology. The primary leverage that I have in my research is from analyzing detailed analysis of the historical processes, and I'm doing that through the data that I gathered in 15 months of fieldwork in these 2 cities, where I did interviews, personal observation in association meetings, kind of went over both legal documents, laws, and other legal regulations, as well as obviously the secondary literature, especially in urban studies, as well as in legal studies about each of these countries. And one last methodological caveat is my research on Buenos Aires is restricted to the city of Buenos Aires. It is not representative of the greater Buenos Aires area. And the reason for that is there is a very stark jurisdictional as well as sociocultural divide between these 2 territories. Therefore, arguments that I make about city of Buenos Aires are not representative of the greater Buenos Aires area, since their institutions are also not equivalent. And in fact, I don't have systematic data on this, but my hunch is greater Buenos Aires actually reveals processes that are similar to the ones in Istanbul than the ones in city of Buenos Aires. And again, I can open that up later on. All right, so let me move on to the empirical, the case studies. So these will be again kind of schematic and brief, but let's look at why I codified Buenos Aires as a case of as a case in which there is institutional transformation towards social urban citizenship. From 1996 onwards, Buenos Aires created a new legal architecture for housing and urban rights, and the central pillar of that architecture is the new city constitution. In the city constitution, Article 31 enshrines housing rights in a very detailed way, in fact, kind of in a way that probably exceeds many constitutional documents. So the article states, the city recognizes the right to decent housing and adequate habitat. For this, it progressively resolves the deficit in housing, infrastructure, and services, with priority given to the sectors in critical poverty. It supports the incorporation of idle estates, meaning vacant units. It wants the vacant units to be incorporated and to be used for the housing needs of the poor. It promotes self-managed housing plans, meaning housing cooperatives and other types of grassroots housing plans that were already present but did not have a legal framework, so the constitution gives them a legal framework. It also supports urban and social integration of marginalized populations, recuperation of precarious houses, and cadastral regularization with criteria of definitive settlement. So what this means is basically it enshrines the visa inhabitants or the inhabitants of the informal settlements right to in situ urbanization. So basically it dismisses relocation, eradication as policy alternatives. So as you can see, the constitution does not simply and abstractly state, all citizens of the city have housing rights. It actually stipulates concrete objectives for the state to fulfill, and in that sense, it creates quite a strong constitutional framework for urban rights claim. Besides the housing rights, the constitution also enshrines a number of participatory rights. So it basically brought public audiences, mandatory public audiences, mandatory public consultation before executive branch or legislative branch make changes in the urban planning code. It also brought grassroots project for legislation as an option. So if you reach a certain number, you can actually make legislation applications. So basically, overall, it creates a strong legal architecture of participation and access to urban space. Besides the constitution, the city legislature also passed several different laws to enshrine urban rights, and the most important one is Law 148, which basically demands the executive to legalize, regularize, and upgrade the informal settlements through a participatory regularization program. And when that program failed or when not enforced properly by the executive, the legislature enacted several neighborhood-specific urbanization laws, again demanding the same objectives. But perhaps, besides the constitution and the legislature, what is even more interesting in the case of Buenos Aires is the role that the judiciary plays in enforcing the rights of the informal inhabitants. Series of judicial sentences protected the rights of visa inhabitants, which is a very controversial issue in itself, because usually judiciaries are the most conservative branches when it comes to the rights of urban squatters, given the centrality of property rights. But in the case of Buenos Aires, judiciary played a very active role by mandating service provision and immediate improvements on habitat, by pausing forced evictions, by ordering urbanization, as well as intervening in neighborhood elections so that representation at the neighborhood scale can be regularized, which would then open the way for the participatory urbanization program. So basically, especially over the course of 2000s, you see the emergence of judiciary as a major institutional venue for developing, for protecting as well as expanding urban rights. And most of the time, expanding urban rights to the new informal settlements that have emerged after the passage of the constitution and the legislation. So here you see a photo from a neighborhood called Rodrigo Bueno, which is a very small neighborhood located in a very, very valuable part of the city, in the Puerto Madero district. And here the judge is basically intervening, after her intervention in the electoral process the neighborhood representatives received these documents. So the case of Rodrigo Bueno and Villa 31 are important because they are neighborhoods that are located in the prime real estate zones. And the fact that the rights of the Villa inhabitants were enforced in this context suggests that there is actually a strong judicial protection of their rights. Because it is especially in these neighborhoods that Villa inhabitants, or it is especially in this context where the contradiction between the rights of Villa inhabitants and the property rights are the most stark, in the sense that since these lands are valuable, here the property interests have much stronger claims on the lands, and therefore, if the judiciary is implementing or enforcing the rights of the Villa inhabitants, it says that there is strong protection of these rights. And in both of these cases, and on the right you see Villa 31, in both of these cases, over the 2000s, the judiciary intervened to prevent the executive branch from undertaking eradication policies. Nevertheless, I categorize Buenos Aires case as an incipient institutional change towards social urban citizenship, because not all these laws are enforced by the executive. So the fact that there are these laws, judicial sentences, do not mean that the executive is actually enforcing them all the time. Most of the time, what we observe is a weak enforcement of housing rights. And this graph shows the decline in the share of housing in the total city budget over the last decade. So it kind of suggests that it is kind of a rough indicator of the fact that despite the strong enshrinement of housing rights, and despite the continuing housing deficit in Buenos Aires, the city is not allocating as much resources as it is supposed to do. And in that sense, it's kind of an indicator of weak executive enforcement of housing rights. So basically, this new legal regime is not being implemented fully in practice. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have significance, but it means that social urban citizenship is not a phenomenon that is fully taking root in practice. So explaining change. And this is a photo from Villa 31.
Is it close to La Boca?
Is that? No, La Boca is further south. So this is the very north by the port and the railways. There is a rail station right behind it, train station right. Okay. So using the causal model that I presented earlier, basically we see three factors that play out in the case of Buenos Aires that explains this formal institutional change towards a social urban citizenship regime. First of all, we see over the course of the second half of 20th century, repeated efforts to enforce property rights through eradication programs. Secondly, in response to those efforts, we see contentious episodes and rights mobilizations emerging. And thirdly, from mid-1990s onwards, we see new political opportunities arising that leading up to the institutional changes that I described earlier. So, regarding the eradication programs, from 1958 onwards, the state made eradication its official public policy. that doesn't mean that it did not tolerate new settlements from emerging, and you see that from 1962 to 1976, the number of Vijay inhabitants grew quite a bit. But nevertheless, even during those decades, there were multiple attempts to eradicate them, and most of these attempts failed. In some cases, some neighborhoods were eradicated, but the broader idea of eradicating all the informal settlements in Buenos Aires and relocating their inhabitants to the greater Buenos Aires area did not realize. And in this, both the resistance of squatters as well as problems with state capacity, intrastate conflicts played a role. In 1976, the last military dictatorship implemented an eradication program brutally, and the number of Vijay inhabitants declined by 180,000 people in 4 years. And the very pretext of those urban redevelopment programs kind of reveals the idea of this property urban citizenship regime that informed the military administrators. So one of them says, quote, living in Buenos Aires is not for anyone. It is only for those who deserve it, for those who accept the standards of pleasant and efficient community life. We need to have a better city for the better people. So basically the last military dictatorship, which is also, you know, the most conservative dictatorship of Argentine history, went on with this urban redevelopment program to create a city for the urban middle classes and upper middle classes, which is considered as the real citizens of the city. Nevertheless, even during this period, you see resistance going on, especially inhabitants of Villa 31, which is the only villa that remained in the northern zone after this eradication program, resorted to the courts to pause the program. And in 1978, the courts, the administrative court actually paused the eradication program until the military officers provide decent housing to the Vijay inhabitants. So after the dictatorship, eradication as a policy got discredited. So from 1984 onwards, you see de facto exceptions and promised de jure exceptions as the state policy. Nevertheless, during the 90s, as part of the neoliberal project of Menem, the government again tried to implement eradication programs in the northern villas. This time it did not target the ones in the south, considering that south is proper for the poor, but wanted to redevelop the north, given the high real estate values in that area. And in the 2000s, you again see an attempt for eradication, but both of these attempts failed in the end. This is on the right. You see the mega project that was prepared for the lands that are occupied by Villa 31. So in response to these eradication programs, you see grassroots mobilization for rights. So first of all, you see the development of federative city-scale organizations over the course of in the second half of 20th century. So these are like different federative organizations that bring together community organizations in different neighborhoods to create a common front against these eradication programs. You also see, local community activists, making claims and organizing neighborhood associations or board of delegates, etc. And in the process, you also see the evolution of a discourse of rights. So initially, the Villa inhabitants claim right to housing, meaning that a house anywhere in the city or even in the greater Buenos Aires area is okay. So if you want to eradicate our neighborhood, give us a house somewhere. From 1966 onwards, you see the demand for a house within the city. So the inhabitants start rejecting being relocated to greater Buenos Aires area, and they start to make claims not only for a house or for a shelter, but also for the urban space that they are part of. And then from 70s onwards, you see this demand for in-city urbanization in the exact location that they reside. So basically, over the years, as these contentious episodes recur, the right discourse also evolved. So overall, this kind of suggests that, and I have many other interview examples that can illustrate this discourse of housing rights being prevalent among region inhabitants. But what I can say for now is that the efforts to implement property rights and eradicate these informal settlements generated both rights demands and rights discourses among the sectors. Finally, from mid-90s onwards, you see new political opportunities arising, and there are two important ones. One is decentralization. So the reform of the national constitution decentralized city of Buenos Aires and made it an autonomous city with its own constitutional legislature and elected mayor. Until then, Buenos Aires was under the tutelage of the federal government. The decentralization process obviously created an institutional design period in which people created, the city created a new constitution as well as designed new political institutions. So there was opportunity to create an expansive Bill of Rights, create new participatory mechanisms, as well as create a judiciary that is quite empowered vis-a-vis the executive. Overall, all of these created new institutional openings to advance urban rights. But we know that decentralization on its own does not necessarily lead to either democratization or welfare state. There are many examples for the reverse path. So, in the case of Buenos Aires, what made decentralization a political opportunity is the emergence of a new left liberal elite. And this left liberal elite was both significant within the local political society, and they had this new discourse against Menem's neoliberal and conservative project, which emphasized both social rights against neoliberalism, as well as strong institutions against the personalism and anti-institutionalism of Menem. So in that sense, a new democratic citizenship kind of became the mantra of this new political elite. But this political elite was also linked to the civil society, especially to the human rights movement. Many of them were past human rights activists, and they had strong linkages to human rights organizations, as well as they had ideological influence over left liberal judicial cadres. So overall, in Buenos Aires, what you see with the decentralization process, these political elites occupying major positions within the legislature, as well as occupying positions within the new institutions of the city. So in the judiciary, for instance, you see, especially in the lower levels of the judiciary, you see new judges that are influenced by human rights discourse, by ideas of social citizenship, etc., etc. So basically, these two factors were quite influential for these rights claims that were already happening to be translated into the institutional arena. And this is from an electoral campaign of this left liberal political elite, kind of showing that this whole neoliberal redevelopment of Buenos Aires was an important issue in the agenda. So this took a lot of time. I will be very, very brief. Please bear with me. Yeah. So. Okay. Istanbul, I examined these questions in two cases, as I said, and let me be very schematic. The case of Istanbul from 1950s to late 1940s to 1990s shows how presents a case of states making routine use of exceptional measures to accommodate popular sectors. So you basically see amnesty laws being issued almost every decade, sometimes more than once in a decade. Title allotment documents being distributed in the 1980s, and promises for titles being regularly exchanged during electoral times. So overall, this very intense and routine use of measures of exceptionality that provided at least partial access to property ownership for the property encroachers limited the incentives or motivations for carrying out rights mobilization. So basically, in this context, the urban poor residents of squatter settlements did not have incentives for appropriating a social right discourse or pushing for institutional changes, since they already had an open path to property ownership. In contemporary Istanbul, obviously we see a drastic change in the urban policy preferences. For the first time in Turkish history, a government is utilizing an anti-gece kondu rhetoric, like speaking of dismantling them, relocating them, and eradicating them. The government also criminalized gece kondus in the criminal court in 2004. It also designed urban transformation projects and to eradicate neighborhoods and relocate the inhabitants to mass housing units. That being said, the broader institutional mechanisms is not so much establishing a strong institutional framework of property rights, but more of reconfiguring exceptional measures for new economic interests. So it's not so much that rule of law is established to protect property rights. It's more like retrieving the past exceptional measures and reconfiguring or reintroducing new exceptional measures to cater to new to different social sectors. This process generated rights mobilizations in neighborhoods. In 3 of the 4 neighborhoods that I examined, you observe rights mobilizations. Even in a place like Başıbüyük, which is a very conservative neighborhood, which voted 70% for AKP in the 2004 elections, there was a very strong and prolonged resistance process. And you see in these processes, inhabitants using discourse of rights, and these are some examples to that, as well as using legal mechanisms to protect their rights, so going to the courts, etc. Nevertheless, rights mobilizations did not create institutional change for 2 reasons. One is limited political opportunities. During this period, we witnessed the re-centralization of urban governments. We observed single-party hegemony, as well as we see a weak and proceduralist judiciary. So when you resort to the judiciary, most of the time, the squatters' petitions are rejected for lack of property rights, for instance. But equally important is the trajectory of particular conflicts in each of these neighborhoods, in which, as the conflicts prolong, the government reintroduced new exceptional measures. And an example of these new exceptional measures is the introduction of new compensation categories. So there is a standard compensation for all inhabitants, which is basically the government pays the value of the demolition. But when conflicts prolong, in different neighborhoods, depending on the strength of the resistance, the authorities introduce a compensation, for instance, for title allotment documents. So people who had title allotment documents could get more compensations. Or they said that in practice we would relax how we calculate the demolition values, meaning that instead of 10,000 we can get 20,000 Turkish liras, which considerably lowers your debt for the new housing unit. In that sense, it makes it more feasible, at least for certain actors within the neighborhoods. So through the reintroduction of these exceptional measures, you see the fragmentation of mobilization processes and decline of resistance in most of these neighborhoods. So overall, when you look at the resistance processes from 2004 to 2012, you see these factors playing out and limiting the opportunities for institutional change. And I can go on and on, but let me conclude here so that we can have a discussion. Right. Thank you so much.
I'll start off. So, what I got out of your presentation is essentially neoliberalism is a really bad idea if you want to create property and citizenship rights in a city. You're better off trying something like essentially AKP-style paternalism rather than, the whole idea of we impose the rule of law and everything. Because then what happens is you get the contested politics and you have essentially the social civil citizenship project become stronger and stronger.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right, and that's how I think about it in a way. So, also, like in terms of reproducing property rights, yeah, you see a conservative populist strategy to be more successful than a strategy where you actually try to diligently enforce property rights in a situation where you lack the resources or where the population lacks the resources to access those rights on its own. Obviously, in the case of AKP, another important element for its success is the financialization of economy, in the sense that there are now more financial opportunities for accessing housing. So perhaps we need to think of these strategies that are targeted to the urban poor, along with those financial opportunities for accessing housing markets.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. First one is kind of like more of a comment than question. Question-ish comment. So basically, this is like a different institutional development story, right? Different paths they take. And you seem to be explaining it by political opportunities and enforcement of rules, or not that wrong. But kind of like, I feel like this is kind of like an ideological explanation at the end. Kind of the ruler's ideology of the time. Some kind of like policy decisions, basically. Policy decisions of the rulers are putting these two cities in different paths when they face contention. Is that correct? Like, would you kind of be comfortable categorizing yourself as such? Kind of as like policy decisions, and policy decisions are made by different institutions, different ideological actors.
Can I
So,
add?
sure. Now I have.
No, I have a related question, so I'm going to add it to the answer. I think, so my question would be that if, using exceptional measures is an important mechanism in differentiating these institutional paths, can we have an explanation for why some governments are more likely to use exceptional measures than others, which I think relates to the other question.
So would you say that's ideological choice, policy, kind of more than the institutions per se?
Yeah, so in the original, the causal model, I also had a few other variables, like background causes, kind of shaping the decision to enforce or make exceptions. But I'm not sure we can reduce it to one of these factors. So I think ideology of the rulers or the policymakers can make a difference. But we should also look at few other factors that are external to the policymakers, and that's what I try to mean by when I said these exceptional measures or these decisions to enforce or make exceptions are embedded in the relations of power within the society. And by that, I do not only mean the ideological dimension of the power relations, but also the simple fact that to what extent urban squatters within a certain polity enjoy electoral leverage over policymakers. So in the case of Istanbul and Buenos Aires, you see a major difference about the electoral leverage of urban squatters. In Buenos Aires, especially in the city of Buenos Aires, that leverage is limited by several things. First, the population is relatively small compared to the overall city population. Secondly, the fact that the local government was under the tutelage of the federal government limited electoral leverage because you do not have electoral power over the mayor. And thirdly, you see a fragmentation within the working class in terms of their housing conditions. So whereas in Turkey, the working class in general got settled in gecekondu neighborhoods, in Buenos Aires, because of the urban policies of Perón, there was more access to formal housing for the working classes, both because they had probably higher wages. Secondly, because Perón instituted certain land policies that provided cheap access to new lands. So in that sense, again, there is a fragmentation within the working class vote. Thirdly, we should look at the strength of the urban growth coalition. So how strong are the urban landed interests in that specific city? Again, for this, I do not have a, this is more of a, I wouldn't say, based on comparative historical reading, I think there are evidences for this, but, if you want to go into that, we need to gather more data. However, it would be accurate to say that the landed interests in the city of Buenos Aires were stronger than landed interests in Istanbul. And this stems from both the property structure inherited from Ottoman Empire, and secondly, because of the expulsion of the non-Muslim bourgeoisie from the city. So, an important landed interest would be the non-Muslim bourgeoisie, but because they were expelled, that force that exists. So in that sense, I think if you want to understand why exceptions were so easy to enact in Istanbul compared to Buenos Aires, I think we should take into consideration how these different factors play out.
My second question, that last point was about that. Kind of like timing of the, kind of like this social contention, the timing of the social contention, although it happens at the same time, obviously compared to method-wise, it's perfectly fine. But timing of the strength of immigration vis-a-vis the proportion of immigration vis-a-vis neoliberalism is maybe different for two cities. Like Buenos Aires is very much more settled city. Correct me if I'm wrong. Than Istanbul. Like Istanbul was like 6 million when I was a kid, and I'm not 100 years old yet. So kind of like it tripled in 20, 30 years. Whereas Buenos Aires actually kind of problem saturated around 1950s, right? Like kind of saturated more or less, immigration slowed down. So kind of like, what type of challenges it puts and how does it, I feel like it strengthens, I don't know the mechanism at all, but I feel like continuous and proportionally very strong immigration kind of strengthens the hand of the neoliberal political makers, maybe, versus the more, like that's landed interest also, made me think of this, versus a settled city where actually even squatters have a history, much more of a history. Kind of, would that make a difference? Like, coming in 1990 and getting into facing facing neoliberal policies versus coming in 1950s and facing neoliberal policies may create a problem for policymakers if they want to opt for the neoliberal exception.
So you mean in the sense that the more settled ones would
be more
show a stronger resistance?
It's a feeling, but I'm not saying like it may be like more conducive to a social rights-based contention and more forceful. It may create a bigger dynamic for social rights, anti-neoliberal policies that we were talking about, versus exceptions like you just got in, you settled, you are good, like you are turning into that into like in 10 years you are turning that into a money, actual money, like with exceptions. That's a big incentive for an unsettled person who is not part of who's not urban yet, like who's not completely urban, who kind of looks at it as not life, not looks at it as life, not good life, let's say.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I
get it. Yeah. No, that's a great question, and the duration of the settlement certainly matters. And in urban sociology scholarship, there are arguments based on how your duration in the city shapes your claim making activity, and that. And you also see that in the case of Istanbul, you see that difference between Başıbüyük and Ayazma, for instance. Ayazma was like, or Armutlu, like Ayazma was a relatively novel, like a recent settlement, which got settled during the 80s and 1990s, whereas Başıbüyük began to be settled in the late 60s, and it made a difference in terms of how entitled people feel on the one hand, as well as how well they are covered by these exceptional measures, etc. So many of the Ayazma sectors were outside of the amnesty laws, and in that sense they felt less secure. So in that sense, yeah, timing matters. But in the case of Buenos Aires, I think one thing that is problematic about this comparison is that I'm not looking across the Buenos Aires metropolitan area. So when you look at the metropolitan periphery of Buenos Aires, you see new settlements emerging every decade. So in that sense, it is quite parallel to Istanbul. So the city was like 3 million in 1950s, now it is 9 million. And most of that happened in the outside of the city. So if we look at those territories, so I think my argument would be much stronger if I'm able to go back and do some research in those peripheral areas and show that there are parallels between Istanbul and the greater Buenos Aires area. And there are several reasons why that would be the case. First, because there is this constant migration happening, and basically the policymakers have to deal with it in one way, and the people have to resolve their housing problems in one way. And secondly, there are more available lands. And thirdly, the electoral system is more open in the greater Buenos Aires area because there are these smaller municipal jurisdictions in which squatters can play a stronger electoral role. So, yeah, so in that sense, the fact that I'm only looking at the city of Buenos Aires kind of makes that comparison like some of the analytical arguments more problematic, I would say. Not problematic, but in the sense that it would be stronger if I'm able to look at the greater Buenos Aires area.
I find it convincing. I find it convincing. I got convinced. I'm just like.
Yeah, I'm very much convinced too. I have an explanation. I'm explanation about something. So you said you are looking at Ayazma, Başıbüyük, and two other districts, right?
So Gülsu, Gülensu, and Derbent.
Okay, so I mean, like, what's the reason you pick those? And like, why is, for example, Sulukule or Tarlabaşı, which are kind of central in the city, not included? And does that make any difference in your arguments?
Yeah, so first of all, I specifically chose those neighborhoods that are informal. So Sulukule, Fener, Balat, and Tarlabaşı, the property conditions are formal in those neighborhoods. For that reason, like that kind of makes a huge difference in terms of these legal regime arguments.
In relation to Tarlabaşı, it might not fit into his argument because many people who are actually living they do not have the means to express their democratic citizenship on the land.
Migrants isn't.
Irregular migrants, they don't have status.
Irregular, not Turkish citizens.
But it's interesting. In Buenos Aires, for instance, most of these regions are also inhabited. Like at least, there is a very significant immigrant population in the regions, especially from 90s onwards. And like because of the whole immigration regime, even their rights are in a way recognized within the city constitution. But that's also one other reason
But
why.
they do have a status, right?
What's that?
They do have a status.
They
as
do
a
have,
migrant.
They do have.
Many in Tarlabaşı don't have any status.
Yeah, they are completely.
Yeah, they are invisible.
So that's one reason why I did not pick Sulukule, Fenerbahçe, and Tarlabaşı. Basically, the property conditions are formal, and most of the time, the resistance in those neighborhoods were waged by the property owners. Like tenants also got mobilized, but the fact that there were like legal property owners made a difference. For instance, in Fenerbahçe, as far as I know from other studies. The reason why I picked Başıbüyük is it's the first urban transformation project in Istanbul being implemented along with Ayazma. And it's the one where you see this prolonged resistance for 2 years, so it gives you good data to understand how these conflicts evolve over time. Gülsü Gülensu is right across Başıbüyük. It's a leftist neighborhood, so it gives me leverage to compare how the ideological configuration of these neighborhoods shape the resistance processes. And it shapes in the sense that Gülsü Gülensu was quite quick to make a move to resist the transformation project. But in terms of the kind of right claims they made, although they made use of social rights, you also observe quite a bit of property rights claims being thrown out, in the sense that give us the property titles and construction permits of this area. And when you talk to the community activists, actually, although like behind the veneer of the leftist discourse, you see similar processes or similar discourses being happening. So, and in fact, there was a participatory urbanization project that got launched in 2004, and that project, if there is a neighborhood that you could go ahead with such a project, like Gülsü Gülensu is the one in terms of the ideological, configuration. There is a history of collective land invasions, this and that. So you can say that one could build upon that tradition. But that project also failed due to lack of interest from the residents.
And first interests, first human beings, and then leftists.
Yeah, I feel like
It's like
I resisted that, but
yeah,
that's kind of no. In the end, I had to accept it.
It might be a form of phone shopping, where you try to use whatever rights language is going to work. If capitalist one works, we use that. If that doesn't work, we go for the social one. If that doesn't work, we go back to the capitalist one.
It's people's
No, but I don't think
home,
anyone.
like their house. So they
I
kind
don't
of,
think
if there's a
anybody
way out,
says, hey,
they
socialism,
open.
no
Yeah.
property rights.
Well, nobody's that kind of socialist anymore.
That doesn't mean
And Derbent is an interesting case in the sense that actually in Derbent you see grassroots attempts for collective property arrangements. So in Derbent there is a initiative to form a neighborhood housing cooperative to negotiate to buy the entire subdivision and then govern it as a participatory housing cooperative. After 2012, government declared Derbent as a risk zone, and that completely puts Derbent in a different legal regime. So I'm not sure how this initiative is going to evolve over time. And I think the reason why you see this initiative taking root in Derbent has to do again with the property relations in the area. Unlike the 3 other cases where the lands are publicly owned, in Derbent a significant subdivision is privately owned. And when the subdivisions are privately owned, there are less opportunities for the government to issue exceptions to transfer the property of the subdivision to the squatters. So you need to actually negotiate with the private landowner. And in order to negotiate with the private landowner, perhaps you need to go for an institutional mechanism like collective property arrangement. So again, like in my fieldwork, there is, like, to be methodologically frank, I focus more on Başıbüyük than these two other cases. So again, as I move on with this project, I plan to do more research to create more evidences for some of these arguments. Any other?
What earthquake zone is that? Like zone? It's kind of like they, if they create that, like. What?
That's what
Yeah,
happens.
this is this zone. Yeah, that's what I meant. But kind of like we are saying that they are opting for neoliberal, but kind of that risk zone is also violating property rights.
No, that's exactly the thing.
That's a very kind of like exception to risk zone, and it's a different tool, no? Like
So that's what I like when I said I was really like quick with my presentation of the Istanbul case, but I think what the government is doing is not so much enforcing property rights, but kind of reconfiguring the target of exceptionality. So again, the government is bypassing planning laws, taking exceptional measures, creating new territories within the urban territory that are governed according to different rules than the dominant rules. And when those, when the objectives of those processes contradict with property rights of, for instance, middle classes, the government has no, pretenses of following, property rights. So I think what is being done under AKP is the reconfiguration of exceptionality for urban capitalist interests. They use the discourse of property rights, especially when it comes to squatters, by declaring them illegal, illegitimate occupiers. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, obviously, they are creating a legal architecture that is stronger in terms of the process. And in the case of earthquake law, this is very, very visible. And in my research, I do not cover the era after the earthquake zone, because I think that's a measure that has to be explored more in detail, and my fieldwork was before 2012. But I think, as I said, it's like a very good example to an exceptional measure.
But also, like in Buenos Aires, there's no risk zone, so it would also be.
What zone? Risk zone.
In Buenos Aires, there's no risk zone, so it would also ruin the fire model.
I mean, from the story, it seems that what's happening is that the AKP is simply smarter as a political organization than the dominant groups in Argentina. They're keeping all their options open. If you legalize too much, if you make too much rule of law, right, then you can't wiggle. But these guys are like essentially creating enough wiggle space for them so that they can use whatever tool they think necessary to increase their winning coalition.
But it's not craft per se. Craft's argument is the, of course, surrounding institutions. So it's not the craft, it's the choices that they can do. Like option set is much more limited, and the option sets are different for two contexts. Yeah. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, and the fact that the national government and the city government is right now fragmented in Argentina is a major. Like, I think the only reason why AKP can be so forceful with this policy approach is the fact that it has monopolized three scales of government. So from national to metropolitan and to the district. But in the case of the district, for instance, after 2009, Maltepe and Sarıyer, moved to JHP. That kind of slowed down the process in Başıbüyük. But when the neighborhood association pressed the mayor to annul the urban transformation decision, he said, he can do it because according to the protocol with Turkey, the municipality has to pay like huge fines to be able to annul the urban transformation protocol. So in that sense, after these laws that were passed during the AKP era, urban governance also got re-centralized, and the district municipalities lost autonomy.
But this municipality can do nothing now.
Yes, of course.
Like it's so centralized, it's incredible.
Yeah.
They can't talk to people like Zabıta has no power anymore. District Zabıta. Only Büyükşehir Zabıta has power. It's so centralized. I constantly call them, I'm the neighborhood watch guy. Right? About noise about this. They can't do nothing. Zero. It's finished. It's 2012.
It's a very dark picture from like a social movement's, success story perspective, right? Because basically, like, there's not a lot of space for agency here. I mean, if you're, at the maybe individual level, but if you're kind of like using these negotiating tactics, yes, but as a social movement, what you're saying is that basically if the political opportunity structure is wrong, then there is not much a social movement can do. Or is that not, the lesson one should,
Do you mean in the context, in the Turkish context, or do you mean
No,
as
no,
a
no,
broader
it's
theoretical?
It's a comparative case, and it looks like, it only leads to like a evolving social rights picture if there are political, opportunities that are available.
I think it's more like even when the political opportunities are not available, for example, like decentralization, etc., are not in the picture yet. You see social movements happening as it happened in Argentina. Not that they can necessarily. In the case of Argentina, at the end of the day, even at its heyday, the Villa movement was not very, very strong. So its mobilization capacity was not, relatively very strong. So, like, depending on the type of social movement, I think social movements also can generate political opportunities by creating elite divides, etc. But it depends on the type of movement. In the case of, I think, urban squatters, this is quite hard to do. And the major problem has to do with the localization of politics and the local fragmentation of politics. In Argentina, the fact that the city itself is single jurisdiction creates opportunities to scale up. In the case of Turkey, localization is extreme. Even within the same district municipality, you see very little ties across neighborhoods. But again, even in that case, it's not only structural opportunities, but specific strategies that the governments utilize. But yeah, overall, I think this gives a bleaker picture than I would want it to give. But yeah, that's right. At this point, I have to admit it.
That's like in Buenos Aires, like in Turkey, like Istanbul, sorry. Like, who is the kind of possible candidate for political leadership? It's CHP, I guess, right? In Istanbul, that's socialists and CHP. Socialists are very small, very big, and CHP is CHP. And no, I'm not in a bad way. Like it's just that's this, What about like Buenos Aires? Like, what's the political leadership of these social movements, these groups? Like, because political leadership, as you said, like they unify. They are kind of they may unify it. They may make it stronger, right? They may change the discourse more to social right. Leadership is important, actually. So, is there any difference between Istanbul and Buenos Aires in terms of that it doesn't have to be a political party, but I am thinking political party, obviously.
Related to this point, actually, I was wondering what is the relationship between the left liberal elite and the working class in Buenos Aires in terms of empowering themselves in shaping the policies and
Oh yeah, there's a class. Yok hayır, bitiriyoruz. Bitiriyoruz.
Çok sağ ol.
Last question, I guess.
Bitirelim mi Okay, in terms of the leadership, so from like late 50s to 70s, it was more the communist activists that were active in generating the federative structures and uniting different neighborhoods. From 70s onwards, left Peronists and like Monteneros and etc. Gained power within these organizations, and they worked as a uniting factor. After 1980s, it's not so much a specific political party, but these neighborhood activists that started playing roles within these federative organizations. And eventually, again, this leadership got co-opted in the mid-90s, and it's fragmented, and one leadership made connections with the left liberal political party to basically press for these urban rights. But the problem with the left liberal political elite is that it never had a strong territorial organization across Buenos Aires. So they were strong within the judiciary and within the legislature, and through that they were able to pass laws. But due to their insufficient capacity in
İşiniz uzun ise biz böyle bir sınıfa gidelim. Çıkıyorsanız yani
Cümleyi bitiriyor. Bir dakika bile sürmeyecek.
Let's move it a bit faster, I'm afraid.
Okay.
No, let's
Yeah, so that being said, basically, lack of organizational strength among the working class, left liberal elite, prevented it from influencing the executive power, and that kind of explains the weak enforcement of many of these legal measures.
All right.
Thank you very much.